on track to now become the first Republican to win the national popular vote in the past 20 years. What are your thoughts on this result?
I mean, I think, first of all, I think that we're going to have to take stock because every single poll that we were looking at, every single one was way off, not by a little, but by a lot. We saw, for example, that young people were basically breaking for her when we actually are looking at the exit polls. Dead even. We saw a massive change in the Latino community where we thought that she was up by 34 points. Not so. And even the white woman suburban vote, who we expected to break for her, did not. They went for Trump. So what did we miss in the polling that was not happening on the ground? I can tell you that for the last 3 weeks, my team and I, we've been in Pennsylvania, we've been in Nevada, we've been knocking on these doors, and this real idea of malaise is setting in. People are not doing well who should be voting on the Democratic Party side, and they're feeling it. When you talk to them...
What do you mean not doing well?
Not doing well economically. You know, when we would do polling and when we talk to these young people, these are Latinos who are 18 to 29-year-olds, and they would say rent was their number one issue. And then you say, well, is it because you want to move out of the house? They're like, no, I need to balance my checkbook because I don't know if I can afford a meal or 2 meals a day.
It's about survival.
Survival.
Yeah.
Right? And so if you're saying that if we can't have a conversation of it's not enough to talk about economic issues around abortion, but also talking about bread and butter issues, that's what we're happening. We're seeing a massive realignment in our political party around socioeconomic and class and educational attainment. Do you have it or not? And those are the conversations that we need to start having if the Democratic Party is to be able to mobilize a community that they technically do represent on paper.
And I just want to point out that the exit polls show nearly half of the voters, 45% of all voters, said they were worse off today than they were 4 years ago. We haven't seen a number that high in the past 5 presidential election cycles. So that speaks to the economy and pocketbook issues really being a factor in this.
Peter, how do you see it? And what were your biggest surprises?
Well, I think it was not surprising, and yet it was still shocking, right? I think that we, first of all, have to acknowledge the extraordinary political resilience of Donald Trump, who did, as he said in that speech, overcome obstacles that no other politician in our lifetime probably ever has ever done. Any one of the things that he has, either one of the defeats or setbacks he has had over the last 4 years would have completely destroyed the career of any other politician. He gets up, he doesn't ever back down, and he managed to tap into this sentiment of resentment, grievance, and unhappiness about the direction of the country. It does say something about the country that they were willing to overlook all of his manifest flaws and setbacks. He is the first convicted felon ever to be president of the United States. He is the first twice impeached president to come back to power. And if he gets the House, he will have a pretty clean sweep. And Washington have a great deal of latitude to define the direction, not just of the government, but of the country going forward. And it's not the country that I think a lot of people, particularly in the coastal cities like here in New York or Washington, thought that we understood.
So, Governor, it's interesting. Peter talks about some of the obstacles, maybe the unprecedented obstacles that Donald Trump overcame to win in this election. On the flip side, Kamala Harris and her team had almost an unprecedented number of resources when it came to money, when it came to manpower. Just to give a couple of data points there was more than $1.4 billion spent on ads by the Harris campaign. That was since President Biden stepped aside from the race. You look at the door knocking, right? More than 3 million doors in Pennsylvania alone were knocked on in just the final weekend before this election. So what went wrong with the Harris campaign?
Well, Jose, you and I have been on the air together quite a bit. And I have been saying for a long time that it always gets down to money and the economy.
You have.
I very much like what she had to say because she's listening. I suffered a tremendous defeat when I was first governor on a referendum. I mean, I got absolutely crushed. And that night, I remember saying to the media, they were right, I was wrong. We have to listen to what people have to say, and the economic challenges out there, plus the fact that I think the Democratic Party, that the tails wag the dog, the progressiveness. People don't want it. They want simple little things, and they don't want to have things shoved down their throat with change that happens too much. For example, the gender issue about boys playing, basketball with girls or whatever. People are like, I've had it with political correctness. I'm not doing well economically. That's what I want the focus to be, and I don't want all this other stuff. And I think Democrats, rather than getting into finger pointing and forming a,
there'll be time for that.
There'll be plenty of time for that. But they need to listen. What is it that the people have said? If you don't listen, you're going to lose.
Marty Testa, and just going off a little bit about what you all are talking about, it's in so many ways, I have often felt as though we live in two different worlds in many ways, Latino community. We live in two different worlds. And oftentimes I'm struck by how many times those that speak about us speak at us and not really understanding what it is that we are, our differences, the things that we worry, our American dream and the definition of that. How is that ever going to be bridged?
Yeah, well, I think, Jose, this is the thing, is that 70% of the Latino workforce works in either hospitality, construction, or farm workers. 70%. They don't have high educational attainment right now. Their children are going on those paths. And so if you do not have a party that's talking to them about the bread and butter issues, the issues that are going to make sure that they are going to not only see the light today, but eventually climb that economic ladder, that's the disconnect. And one of the things that we have to decide on the progressive side is how do we communicate the values that translate to being able to pay your rent, to be able to pay your bills. I can tell you that when I went door knocking in Pennsylvania, not everybody's, they're working class, they're working hard, they're not union members, they don't have a collective, there's not a bargaining, farm workers don't have unions, construction workers don't have unions. I mean, you can go down the list, right, of these major areas of workforces that don't have a collective voice.
So where did things go wrong? Where was that communication? Where was that communication?
So, Anna, you said, well, she had all the money in the world, but she also did not have time. Trump has been campaigning for 9 years.
Yeah.
She had 104 days. If you were to tell me how to do things differently, I mean, we could point fingers, but I would have deployed people immediately into the field. I think a lot of the lessons that was taken away was that how do you run a campaign under pandemic conditions? And that was all online. But people need to be seen and need to be heard and need to be felt and need to listen to. And there was not anything. And so when you start talking about the care economy, for most working class people, that we don't understand what that means.
This concern is not just among Latino voters.
No, it's not.
There are so many Americans.
Right.
Here's what many Americans believe, that they're not going to be better than their father and mother. They're not going to be better than their grandfather, that they're not gaining ground, they're losing ground. And so Trump's going to have a big challenge here to be able to show them as he begins to govern. And look, we got to respect the presidency. We just can't be in this fighting mood all the time. But he's going to have to demonstrate how he's going to give people a sense that their lives can be better than their mothers and fathers. Because right now, I think there's so many of them that don't believe it. That's why he won the popular vote.
Well, Donald Trump really made a central focus of his campaign also the immigration issue. And we can all remember kind of what became a mantra, that he is going to carry out the largest deportation operation in American history. And yet, in the exit polling, the majority of Americans actually believe there should be a legal path for immigrants in this country to apply for citizenship. How do you square that?
Look, on immigration, America has been conflicted for a long time. It believes multiple things at the same time. It does believe in a lot of ways that there should be a path to citizenship for those who are here. At the same time, it believes that the border ought to be secure and that people who are here illegally shouldn't be rewarded for that. So you can say that that's not reconciled, and that's true. But what you hear from Trump is, of course, one side of that equation, right? The Democrats used to talk about path to legalization all the time as the price for border security. They don't do that anymore. The border package that Senator Langford negotiated that Kamala Harris said she would have signed didn't include all those traditional Democratic priorities. It was
Didn't
really
mention
very heavy
DACA. Didn't mention comprehensive immigration reform. Zero.
Politics
This
of that
idea,
has shifted dramatically.
Right. So you basically have 1 out of 5 people, Americans know someone who's undocumented. 1 out of 5. It's not small. And to run away from DACA, to run away from creating protections for people that have been here for 10, 20, 15 years, 30 years paying taxes, that was an unforced error. I can share with you when we talk about close to 16 million Americans live in mixed status families. That includes white moderate Republicans who have a loving spouse that is undocumented, right?
And yet Trump won support of 45% of Latino voters.
Well, we'll
see. He wants to round people up.
100%.
A lot of Latino voters would say that they came here legally. Why should somebody else not?
Well, they wouldn't say that, but they would say that they were fine. I've
heard that quite a few.
What a lot of Republicans say, and I was just in a heated discussion with a friend of mine about this, close the border.
Yep.
What's going on? They're all just coming in here, and we got criminals. But when you get right down to it and you start to talk to them in a calm way, they don't want to see people just put on buses. I think there's a way.
And I've taken heat for saying this, but that border bill that did not pass, and that couldn't probably pass, was used as a political piñata. And it's the repetition of using shiny objects to not talk about really substantial issues that affect millions of people that have been here for years, that contribute to our country, that are vetted in so many ways, and the people that have DACA that know no other country but this. Why are those people always forgotten? And that is something that we should one day shine a light back on. And until that happens, all of this is a lot of platitude.